Greetings and welcome. My name is Will Ruiz. I'm a Makemo librarian at the LA County Library, and today we're going to do a simple origami craft. Today we're actually going to make this paper ball, sometimes called an origami water balloon. I'm going to give you step-by-step instructions along the way, and I encourage you to pause or rewind the video as needed for any steps that are difficult, although I will cover those difficult steps a couple times to make sure they make sense. So for those of you who haven't done origami before, one of the main things I want to explain is that we really want this to be a fun and a calming experience and not a frustrating one. So try and be patient as you're making the folds so you can have fun along the way, and do be careful and precise as you are making your folds though, because it will make your final product look a lot better in the end if you take your time to align the edges of the paper very accurately as you're folding. But that doesn't mean you should get discouraged if your model doesn't look exactly like mine on your first attempt. I promise you will get better with practice. So along the way, I'm going to point out a couple elements of geometry that you might notice in the origami folds that we're creating, including angles that are created by some of the folds that allow us to actually deduce the measurement of other angles in the shapes that we're going to end up with. We're going to cycle through a bunch of geometric shapes, so I'll stop a couple times to point out some of those angles that we've created. And I'm also going to point out elements of symmetry in the folds and in the final product. You will notice that a lot of origami relies on symmetry. In some cases, it will be what we call bilateral symmetry, where you will do the same thing to one side or make one side look the same as the other. So imagine a line down the paper and everything on this side will be the same as on this side. But I will also point out that for this particular model, you're going to see elements of what we call radial symmetry, which is essentially symmetry along a central axis. So imagine a point directly in the center of the paper, and you'll see multiple lines of symmetry that all cross through that central point. So for example, from here to here, from here to here, but also at the diagonals from this corner to this corner, and also this corner to this corner. So as you'll note, all of the elements of symmetry all go through this central radius in the middle of the paper, or the central axis rather, and that's why it's called radial symmetry. So let me go ahead and get started with the folds. The first three folds that we do are going to be so that we can make creases that will help this piece of paper fall into what we call an origami triangle base. And I'll show that part a couple times. You'll notice I am working with a square piece of paper. So before we get started, actually, let me explain really briefly how to turn a simple rectangular piece of printer paper into a perfect square with just a couple folds. Okay? So I've folded creases in this paper previously to save us some time. But the main thing I want to point out is if you have a rectangular piece of printer paper like this, it'll be 8.5 by 11. And in order to turn it into a perfect square, what we can do is take this corner and bring it all the way down to this end, making sure that this line aligns pretty perfectly with this line going down the side. So if we do that and redo the crease that I've already folded for you, you'll want to make sure that this comes to a fine point and that this edge is lined up all the way throughout the paper to make sure you have the closest to a perfect square you can get. Following that, you can either take scissors and very carefully cut along this line in order to remove this strip of paper, or if you like and you find it helpful, you can fold this strip of paper up as far as it will go so that it creases right at the end of that line. And that should give you a nice line to follow when you're cutting. And you might even be able, if you're careful, to simply just rip that piece of paper off. But if you want it to be perfect, I recommend cutting that off. And then what you'll end up with will be a square of the same size that I'm starting with over here. Okay, so let's get started with the folds. Like I said, the first three folds are going to be in order to create creases that will allow this to fold easily into a triangular base. So we're going to first execute these folds, and then we're going to unfold them to expose the creases we made. So the first fold is going to be bringing this corner all the way down to this corner, which will create a crease going from here down to here. So I'll show you what that looks like. Especially for these first couple folds, you want to be careful to line up the edges as well as you can. Okay, so now I've turned that square into a triangle. One thing I want to point out, actually, just in terms of geometry, as we had before with the square, we know that these are all right angles of 90 degrees. And geometry also tells us that the 4 angles of a perfect square are going to add up to 360 degrees. So when we fold this in half, you'll notice that it's going from a square to a triangle. We still have this right angle right here on this particular triangle, but the difference is for a triangle, the 3 angles are going to add up to 180 degrees. But since we know we started with a 90-degree angle over here that we simply split in half, and because we know that the angles will add up to 180 degrees, this tells us that if this angle is 90 degrees, then both of these angles amount to 45 degrees in order to leave us with the 180 degrees that we should have in a triangle. So keep that in mind. There'll be other shapes that we come across that have different angles, and there's a different sum that all of those angles will add to. So I'll point that out as well. But let's go ahead and undo that fold so we can continue to get to our triangular base. And let's go ahead and do the exact same fold along to the opposite corners. So we're going to bring this corner down to this corner now, and that'll create another crease going to the opposite corners. And like I said, we're just making creases, so let's go ahead and unfold that. Now, if you've done what I just did, you're going to have the valley of the fold facing up, but we actually want our next fold to go in the opposite direction as the previous two. So to make sure that we do that, let's go ahead and flip this paper over so that it's popping up off the table just a little bit, like a little mountaintop. The next fold that we're going to do will be bringing this line all the way down to line up with this line down here, which will generate a crease right through the middle where those intersect. So I'll show you what that will look like. And then again, we're gonna unfold that because we wanna have all 3 creases just to help us get to the next shape we need to arrive at. So let's go ahead and undo that. And if you will, pop the center out again so that it's sticking up a little bit off the top of the table. So again, popping up like a mountaintop. And then these 2 folds, the crease you went through the center should be having a valley basically. And what we're gonna do, I'm gonna show you this a couple times, but what we're gonna do is bring it into a triangle shape. And the way to do that is by bringing these 2 folds together, so essentially pushing them in so that the corners can meet on the other side. And what that allows us to do is actually flatten this shape into a triangle. So I'll show you that one more time. You can start here. If you'd like, I'll show you from the other side. If we bring these corners that got folded together along the parallel through the center, then you'll actually be able to bring it down and flatten it down onto the table. So this brings us to what we call the triangular origami base. I encourage you to pause it and rewind a couple times if you're having trouble with this step. But again, this is a base that we'll arrive at that'll be a starting point for a lot of other origami models. So once you master how to get into this shape right here, you'll be well off to continue your exploration of origami. So we're back at a triangle, and this next fold we're going to execute 4 times. So it's going to be executed on the left and then the right, and then also we're going to flip the model over and do the same thing on the back 2 flaps. First thing I want you to notice is that you have 2 flaps of paper under here. and we're only going to fold one at a time. So let's fold the top flap, and we're going to bring this corner all the way up to this corner, which is going to line up with this center line right here, this imaginary line that you can see there. So I'll show you what that looks like. And you want it to come to a pretty sharp point right there. And now let's do the same thing to the other side, bringing this corner over to this corner. And that is meaning that this line right here will line up with this part of the other fold, like that. So let's go ahead and flip the model over and do the same thing to those two flaps, folding them the opposite direction. So again, bringing that all the way to the top corner as far as it will go. And then doing the same thing to the opposing side. So we've gone from triangle back to square again. And I still want you all to notice that you still have these flaps that you're dealing with. So for these next 4 folds, we're going to do the same fold 4 times, just like we did to bring it down to this square shape. And you want to make sure that this line is going up the center and that you have flaps top and bottom. So take the top flap, and we're going to bring this corner to rest at this midpoint and try and generate a crease that is roughly parallel right here to right there. So I'll show you what I mean by that. It's better that you don't quite go to that line rather than going over the line. And then we're going to do the same thing to the other side. Remember that we have another flap on bottom that we're not touching right now. And we'll bring these to the center to meet and hopefully get those to be somewhat parallel. If it's not perfect, we'll still be able to get to the final shape we're looking for. And now let's flip this model over and do the same thing to the other side. If you like, you can rotate it, obviously, whichever direction you're more comfortable with to make your folds easier. I do find it easy to fold them up rather than to the side. And now we've arrived at a hexagonal shape. And let's take another break for a quick geometry lesson. So we can recognize that we have a right angle right here, right? And right here. Both of those should be 90 degrees. And we know that because we originally started as a square. So those angles were each 90 degrees going along the sides of the square. But what does that mean for the angles of the hexagon? Well, the angles in a hexagon will always add up to 720 degrees. But this hexagon we have right here is not a regular hexagon in that not all of these sides are going to be the same length, which also means that not all of these angles are going to be the same number of degrees. So then in order to figure out how many degrees each of these two angles are, we'll need to do some quick math. We know that both of these right angles at the top and bottom are 90 degrees. So if we add them together, we'll have 180 degrees. And that would mean that the remaining sum of these 4 angles is 540 degrees. Because if we take 720 and subtract 180, we're left with 540. Now we're pretty sure that these are all equal in the number of degrees, but let's do a quick fold in order to prove that. If we fold this down the middle, we'll notice that those angles all line up. And same thing if we fold it down the other axis, that those angles will all line up. So what that means is that of the remaining 540 degrees, if they're all equal, we can simply divide that number by 4, and we'll arrive at a sum of 135 degrees for each of these 4 remaining angles, in order to end up ultimately at 720 degrees for all of the angles that are enclosed by a hexagon. So let's move on and finish up these last couple folds. This next step we're going to do 4 times as well, just like the previous 2. And I need to show you one little section where we're going to be folding into. So if you notice at the area where these were folded over, if you poke your finger into there, you can open up a little pocket. You'll also notice that above that pocket, there is a small flap of paper, actually at a 45-degree angle right here. And what we're going to do is open up this pocket a little bit and tuck this flap of paper into the pocket as far as it will go. You'll notice it's not going to go all the way into the pocket. It'll be sticking out about that much. But as soon as it stops, you can go ahead and crease it. And even if it doesn't go in quite perfectly, it'll still be able to be inflated into the shape we're looking for. So let me show you that 3 more times. On the other side, we have a pocket here formed by these 2 pieces of paper. So we'll open that up and tuck this flap inside and push it all the way. And let's flip this over and do the same thing to the other side. So remember, there is the flap. And we can open that up slightly and then insert that. And for the last time, here's the final pocket. If you just push down on it a little bit, it should open. And tuck in that flap above it as far as it will go. All right, so that was the last of our folds. So believe it or not, we are already done. The last thing that we need to do with this shape is to inflate it with air. So the best way to do that is to pull these sides apart a little bit. The area that you need to inflate has a small hole at the side, at the point right there, and it is the side that is opposite of the flaps that you just folded. So you can see the flaps right here, and the section where you need to inflate is on this end. So if you hold it like this by spreading apart those sides, then you can inflate it with air with a couple quick puffs. What you want to do is don't attempt to seal your lips around it and expect 100% of the air to flow into the ball. Just imagine that you're blowing past the ball and a lot of the air will still end up inflating it, and you can stretch it apart as you inflate it. Alternatively, if you're having trouble, you can take a pair of scissors and make a very small cut at the end. Just make sure you cut the end that already has a hole, which again is opposite from the sides that you already folded. And that should make it a little bit easier to inflate. So let me do that and I'll show you what it looks like. All right. So you can start to work out any kinks or crinkles that you made. If you want, you can also fold the edges to make a nice tight cube like what I showed you previously. And let me actually show you my other example, where I've basically just made creases at the end and ended up with a more cubic shape. But that's all there is to it. And you'll notice actually, if you take a ruler, we started with an 8.5 by 8.5 piece of paper. But if you do measure each of these sides of the cube, you'll actually notice that it's a more or less perfect cube, and each of those sides is actually going to measure 2 inches. So we really hope that you enjoyed this origami tutorial. We do hope to see you in the library soon, but in the meantime, we encourage you to visit us at lacountylibrary.org or at LA County Library on social media. And if you just folded one of these along with us, we also would love to see what you made. So please send us your results, and we hope you have a great day.